Hello and welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. We're on location today at South Station and we're approaching the motif of South Station. And we're going to be thinking and talking a little bit about color, some color strategies, some properties of color that every painter should be aware of, and try to employ those into our subject. This is South Station in Boston, and it's one of those grand buildings that just has a lot of character to it. It's fun to look at, and we're going to be painting it today. We're standing in front of our location, working on a beautiful day in South Boston. So I've got my sketch here, and I'm keeping the image up in the right corner intermittently so that you can see where I follow the subject and where I depart from the subject. It's a warm, humid day, and I want to bring out the warmth in the building, and I want to contrast that with some cool colors. I'm starting with yellow ochre, which is great for generating kind of an underpainting of warmth, and it works well as a first layer. It doesn't work so well if you apply it on top of colors. It tends to make other colors just feel heavy. And that's true for a lot of yellows. Yellow ochre has a bit of opacity, which really is not too important at this stage, but it does generate warmth to the building that I'm going to be painting. And you see I dropped in some cerulean blue, which is a pleasant blue, it's a little bit of a greenish blue, into the top part of the painting, and just let it drift down wet into wet. I like this way of building up the light tones, the light notes of the painting. And I try to keep the wash fluid and not too detailed at this point, except for the crosswalk here. The crosswalk is my kind of entrance into the painting. It's a pretty strong entrance when you see it like this. It's such a contrast to the rest of the painting. So right now it's taking control of the painting. Again, I'm using warm tones, some burnt sienna, some cobalt blue, a broken tone, a gray, in the foreground. I want to really capture today the feeling of this humid day with a kind of diffuse sunlight falling everywhere. So this is the underpainting. Once I let it dry off, it's dried off now, so I'm starting up in the left-hand corner with some very distant buildings. The quality of the South Station is a rounded building. The facade is very round, and it sits on a corner. We're looking directly at that corner, so I want to convey that turn in the building if I can. And in this application, I'm being pretty free-form. In other words, I'm taking paint directly from the palette, using a pretty large brush, and mixing the color directly on the painting. I'm not really mixing it in the palette. This is it's a little departure for me. It's a great way to preserve some brighter colors. Even though we're making grays, we're mixing grays on the paper. As it dries, you'll see that the property of that burnt sienna, the property of the ultramarine blue, is more present. And this is because it's mixed loosely on the paper while it's wet. I'm really only interested in keeping a couple hard edges up where we see the clock and the eagle. The rest of it is in shadow, and again I'm using these darker tones to make it feel like the building is coming towards us and turning in the front. And I'm bringing that right down to street level. I want a darkish background against the bright entrance. It's a great way to set up this idea that it's being lit from behind or from the side, and that light is falling on the street but is being broken or interfered with towards the back. You see that my board is moving constantly. That's to control the flow of this very wet wash. I don't want it to move in this case. I like the way it's setting up. So I flattened it out, and I'll address that beautiful eagle on the top. I kind of missed an opportunity in the architecture here. It has more of a scrolled promontory, but I lost the opportunity. So I'm not stressing over it. I'm just finishing it off. This is an important part of the painting, and trying to wet it. The wash below is still quite wet, so I'm trying to blend it in so that it feels like a natural extension of the building with some extra sharpness up there. I want that to come forward from the buildings that are behind, left and right, and really feel like it's projecting towards us. So I'm using a bit more of a warm hue there and a little bit more of a darker hue. As I come back to the buildings, you see by the shine on the paper, it's still very wet. This is a good sign, means we can continue to add color to the wash, build it up. I'm going quite strong with some ultramarine blues on top of the warm hues. And this is to, again, make the building fade away at the corners, make it feel like it's coming towards us, and put some cooler shadows into the whole area. All basically wet into wet or dry into wet. So this is taking advantage of that warm underpainting. As it dries, you'll see some of those yellow ochres coming through, especially on the left-hand side where I've applied very little color, and even left some of the original underpainting as highlights on the edges of buildings. And the right side, you'll see more of that yellow ochre coming through also. So taking advantage of watercolor's transparent nature and taking advantage of a color strategy, which is to place a cool on top of a warm to make it feel like it's glowing, to make the building appear to be glowing in the shadows as though light is bouncing back up into the building and creating a luminosity in the shadows. This next stage, I'm still working on the wet painting. The painting hasn't dried yet. You can see it's glistening towards the back there, but I feel I have to work around the periphery and start to place some sense of the figures. And the strategy here is to create figures at various depths in the painting. Some very far away, some almost right upon us, and then some of my major figures sort of in the midground coming out from that dark. But you can tell that I'm actually extending the dark via some blobs coming straight down onto the crosswalk. This is another strategy, and while we don't really feel the whole figure coming through, I can see in the torso and the leg, and the head will come later. This is another strategy to give your figures variety, is save the head. It sounds funny when I say it when the words are coming out of my mouth, but save the head for later. That we can put the head on the right or left shoulder, make it feel like it's walking in a different direction, coming forward, going away from us. We can tell a lot just by how we position the head, so I'm kind of saving that for the end. And working in sort of an abstract mode, by extending this dark, I'm basically breaking up the shape, extending it what I feel is in a positive way to the lower part of the painting, staggering it, giving myself a intermittent edge of that dark. And I'm warming it up, in case you haven't noticed. I'm putting a few more siennas, a few more reds into the figures to bring them forward from that blue haze that we see back there. And there's the symbolic dog in the midst of all these. Well, we saw quite a few when we were standing in front of South Station. People are traveling a lot with their dogs these days, taking them into the malls, taking them into the public spaces, cafes. So the figures now are starting to materialize. I'm leaving a few whites to kind of carry the eye towards the back. Don't want to paint all of it. Add some shadows, extending the figure, darkness, the dark of the figure basically down and to the right, giving us, again, another understanding of how the light is moving across the scene. So this is an example of using warm and cool hues, basically. The hues themselves, the colors are grays. They're all broken hues mixed mostly on the paper. And the strategy here is to play the warmer hues of the foreground and the figures against the cooler hues in the background and get a forward feeling as well as a feeling of overhead light. Complementary hues are also a good working thought. In this painting, not as much, perhaps when we get into some of the local colors on the figures, we'll be using some reds and oranges. If we're talking about the primary hues, the complement to blue, which we're using a lot of, would be orange. The complement to yellow would be violet. The complement to green is red. And what that means for us as painters is that if we place a red next to a green, we make both of those colors a little more exciting. They tend to vibrate a little more. So often when I'm thinking about a painting in terms of its color composition, I look to the complements. Blue, I'll pair that with some oranges and some reds. If it's a violet twilight composition, I'll use more yellows. If it's a green painting, I'll try to accent some reds. It's not that that's the only part of the color plan that I have, but it does help to understand that when you're looking to make your color a little more vibrant, a little more energetic. In the case of the figures, it's a good strategy to offset a blue with an orange. We'll do that into some of the faces. Another good strategy for us as painters is to actively seek out a dominant hue in the painting. When we're on location and looking at our subject, it's pretty easy to identify a major color. And in that case, I try to let a part of this major color enter into all of the other colors. This case being blue. Blue is really kind of finding its way onto the building, into the crosswalk, into the figures, into the sky in various degrees. So look for a major color in the composition. I think about complementary colors. I think about building up the color by in two ways technically. One is through layers. As you saw, we did an underpainting of warm hues followed by a layer of cooler hues, and trying to effectively bring out some luminosity in the painting. And secondly, mixing the color on the paper. I think that goes a long way to creating beautiful color. It's not so easy. In other words, we're trying to effectively create a certain tonality in our color. So if we approximate that by mixing colors on the page, we get a big advantage going forward. And perhaps the main piece of advice about color that I can state from experience and a working knowledge is that I try to avoid matching color. In other words, if I'm standing in front of my subject and I have a clear view, it's very easy to get caught up in the habit of looking up and matching this green, looking up and matching this blue, looking up and matching this gray. This is a very slippery slope and usually results in kind of incoherent quality in the painting. One area is bright, the other places is not complementing that. Because we get too caught up in the smaller parts of the painting and trying to match the color that we see. Rather, I try to think of those things which I mentioned and try to build up the color in that manner, where I actually, I guess, am more of a tonalist in that I am really seeking for and exaggerating the light and dark aspect through color. So color is sort of a secondary element to me, but I realize that it's important for a lot of people, and I use it probably instinctively at this stage But in thinking about how I use color, I realize that these are some of the strategies that I use. Cool against warm, complementary hues, major color in the painting, mixing color on the paper, and for me it's more important not to match color, not to try and follow the color. So I keep my eyes on my painting 80% of the time. I look up when I need a piece of information. I look up when I need something from my subject, but I make my decisions pretty early on, even before touching the paper, and I try to keep those in the front of my mind. And then once I start painting, I try to forget everything. I try to just be empty-minded and concentrate on what's going on in the paper. So that information about color, I think, is very practical. I think it will help any watercolorist. And I know that those little things have helped me. I have some drills on my YouTube page of mixing colors, and those are useful from a point of view of you're not painting a subject, you're not worried about proportion or anything like this. All you're worried about is the color on the paper and watching it and seeing how it reacts. I think for the watercolorist, we have a lot to deal with because all our colors are built up from natural elements, dyes and minerals. They all have a different weight, they all interact in a different manner, and some play very well together, others take over the painting, and through doing these drills or just by doing color swatches and these sorts of things, you get a lot of information about the colors that you use. And that's important because each manufacturer is using a different formula. And it might say ultramarine blue, but it's going to look differently if you put them side by side. So I'm showing a short video that we shot on scene, and you'll see another painting done on location, and I used a much warmer hue in this case for the building. And I'm going to show you that painting later just so you can compare. For me, this was a little too hot, the facade of South Station, so I went through a couple of iterations, which is not that common, but this subject was challenging in a lot of ways for me, and I wanted to effectively create this feeling of a crowd coming towards us and moving towards South Station. I wanted the profile of South Station. I wanted the light of that particular day. So I went through a couple iterations. This is another one. Here I feel the composition is not great because I kept the interest too low in the painting. But I did learn a few pieces of information from this painting, and I tried to apply it to the last work, which has been the demonstration that you've just watched. This is it here. I moved the horizon up a little higher and made the most of the eagle and the top part of South Station. Introduced more blue into this one to cool it down and effectively push that foreground towards us. So this has been a good piece for me because I learned a few bits of information on the way, and I hope it was helpful to you to hear some of the things that I think about when I'm painting in terms of color.